What I thought I would do is go through actually some of these studies myself. And by writing about it on a blog, I would teach myself about nutritional psychiatry, what's true, what's not, what's true about exercise in psychiatry, what's true about this, what do we know and what do we not know.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Dr. Drew Ramsey podcast. It is great to be with you talking about mental health and how to improve our mental fitness. And we have got one of the original Nutritional Psychiatry All-Stars with us, one of the original influencers, Dr. Emily Deans. She is a board-certified psychiatrist. She's based in Massachusetts, but she is born and raised in Texas. She's a Texan at heart. She received her medical degree from UT Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, and then she went to Boston to Harvard, where she trained as an adult psychiatrist. She is an international speaker around food, mood, and evolutionary psychiatry. She has had one of the original blogs around food and mental health, Evolutionary Psychiatry, on Psychology Today. And she's the co-author of a book on the treatment of somatization disorder called Stop Being Your Symptoms and Start Being Yourself. We'll have links to all of these things in our show notes. Dr. Emily Deans, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Drew. Thanks so much for having me on. Always enjoy talking to you.
Oh, it's such a treat. Now, Dr. Deans and I have been colleagues and friends, and thinking about nutritional psychiatry really, since just after residency, this is like 2007, 2008. I remember researching the happiness diet, and my co-author, Tyler Graham, said, do you know this awesome psychiatrist at Harvard, Emily Deans? She's writing all about this stuff. Can you take us back then? What were you thinking? How did you start thinking about writing for the public and about evolutionary psychiatry?
So I was really interested in ancestral health back then, which was sort of just becoming, this was kind of the big explosion of the paleo diet and primal body, primal mind, and that kind of thing. And I was partly interested in this because this was also the mid 2000s, and we had just learned that a lot that we knew about therapy and medication treatment for psychiatric illness, that there was a time when a lot came out that they had hidden a lot of the negative studies, for example, about SSRIs. Not that I don't find SSRIs very useful in certain populations, but I was a little bit kind of discouraged and disappointed in the field and what we knew. And so I was looking for alternative ways besides therapy, which is not always, look, I appreciate therapy. It's not my interest as much. I do practice it, obviously. And I know all of the different modalities of therapy and we go through things, obviously. But, for psychiatrists, it's not quite as 100% what we do. I work more with the medications. But it just wasn't, some people are super interested in just therapy and learning about it and then the psychology of it.
I think I'm a little bit more in that boat. I think about you. I love meds. I do in working with them, but I think about you as a little bit more meds biology, and me as a little bit more like psychodynamic psychiatry.
Right. The philosophy of therapy and stuff like that. It just wasn't my interest. Yeah. And yeah, you're which I appreciate about you, because it's always fun to talk to therapy with people who are really excited about it. But so I was thinking, are there alternative ways to get better or to at least supplement, normal treatment of therapy, plus or minus meds, right? And so I was looking at these things like primal body, primal mind, and all these, and I said, wow, when I implemented a paleo diet, for example, myself, which obviously we don't have a real paleo diet because I don't hunt and fish for myself, et cetera, and I don't have a tribe around gathering hundreds of different types of plants, throughout the year that we nibble on. But what I basically did was cut out at the time processed food and dairy and alcohol and all those other things. And it was really helpful for me because I'd spent most of my life on one diet or another. And it was so much easier. I wasn't counting calories. After I had my kid, I just naturally lost a bunch of weight very easily. I didn't have to think about it. I just had to kind of eat the right kinds of foods. And so I was like, wow, and my skin looks better. My nails are really nice. This has to be affecting the brain because as we know, the ectoplasm that makes our skin and our nerves are basically the same kinds of things. So I thought, okay, is there any evidence of something like food and mood? Not necessarily just paleo diet. Obviously, there's no evidence because that was new at the time. But the Mediterranean diet, for example, there's starting to be studies about that. And then reading some of these pop diets about food and mood, pop self-help books about food and mood, I chased down some of the references in the back, and I realized that most of those books, can I swear? It was mostly BS, I guess I will say. That they were vastly overinterpreting the studies that they were talking about in the back of the books, for example.
Tell us a little bit about that. Just, I think so many people listening, they look at a book, they see a credential, a physician or a nutritionist, they see a few studies, citing stuff. And it's hard not to know, or kind of believe, wow, that person knows what it's talking about. Where do you see kind of an overinterpretation? What's that mean?
So they'll find a very small study of, for example, magnesium supplementation providing, helps you with headaches or something like that. And it's very small studies, small effect size. Maybe it wasn't even placebo controlled, for example, so they didn't have a group that wasn't on magnesium. And you'll read in the book, magnesium was super helpful for headaches, which it can be. Don't get me wrong. But then you look at the citation, you look at the study, and you're like, well, the study has a lot of limitations. And plus, it doesn't really say it was that great for headaches. The effect size of the study of the magnesium was actually very small. And so that's what I mean by kind of over-interpretation. And you could find, unfortunately with PubMed and all that, there's a lot of junk science out there. So you can really find justification for almost anything that you want to say. And we're taught in medical school and in residency, for example, psychiatry, that there are a few top tier journals. There are not that many of them. And you can kind of trust what comes out of them, but we're also kind of think about it critically. And Lord knows I'm not a statistician, but, I'll try and see if something makes sense, if the effect size seems reasonable, for example. That's some of the things with psychedelic research, for example, the effect sizes are really large, and that can make you a little bit more skeptical of the data and kind of look at it a little bit closer. There may be something really there, but you just have to have your critical thinking hat on with all these things. And those are all the stuff that we're taught in medical school. And so I wouldn't expect a lay person to kind of do that sort of stuff. And so what I thought I would do is go through actually some of these studies myself. And by writing about it on a blog, I would teach myself about nutritional psychiatry, what's true, what's true about exercise in psychiatry, what's true about this, what do we know and what do we not know. And of course, you find the more you know, the more you don't know about the gut, the microbiome, parasites, our immune system, autoimmune, all that stuff is just really fascinating to me. And so I just kept looking at different studies and writing about it.
I wouldn't call it a tangent. It's just I happen to know that Dr. Deans has got a super cool kind of deep piece of knowledge around parasites in our brain and how they affect our mental health. And nobody ever thinks about this, and it freaks everyone out to think that we can get parasites in our brain. But will you tell us a little about the connection between parasites and mental health?
So this is one of those evolutionary psychiatry things. So it wasn't true that we were exposed to a bunch of the modern viral illnesses all the time, because most of them came with agriculture. Most things like flu and coronaviruses and stuff like that, they tend to spread around amongst herd animals. And so, we didn't spend a whole lot of time until we raised them. And sometimes, you start to have pigs and llamas or whatever in your hut with you. That's when you get exposed to more of these kinds of modern. So I consider them sort of diseases of civilization or modern. And humans lived in groups of 20 to 120 or whatever, and pretty far spread out. And ventilation was great because you just had a hut with no glass, right? And so, but we were exposed to heavy amounts through our entirety of our evolution was tons of parasites. So flukes and tapeworms and all that kind of stuff. Just like if you get a rescue dog, you have to deworm them, right? Because all animals out in the wild that they eat or whatever have lots of parasites and worms in them. And certainly in developing nations, parasites are a big problem. They actually kill, hookworms kill tons of children through anemia and things like that. So there's a positive to not having parasites. But without parasites, there's an entire section of our immune system that's sitting around with nothing to do. And that's where they think that a lot of autoimmune disorders come from. So that that part of our immune system, let's say we have an entire tank brigade that's just bored and they're like, we want to blast something. And so it starts to sort of blast ourselves.
Is it specific what they call hemolyths? Is it like a part of our immune system that's really focused on the parasites and worms and these types of things?
It's the IgE and certain kinds of T cells. There's a really good Graham Rook is a really good guy to read about this kind of thing. He has some fun, kind of really short articles about it. It's not really layperson necessarily, but they're pretty accessible. But so we remember we co-evolved with parasites, and so we have that part of our immune system. And then there's lots of evidence now that some types of psychosis, that some types of OCD, and other kinds of anxiety and psychiatric disorders, people with autoimmune disease have much higher rates of depression and anxiety and psychiatric disorders. Everyone who's a psychiatrist has worked on consult liaison in the hospital and seen someone with lupus, who or autoimmune hypothesitis, just different kinds of really random autoimmune disorders can cause psychosis and other psychiatric symptoms, right? And so there are stories of people. There was this one guy who had terrible, actually asthma. He was desperate, and he went to Africa and infected himself with hookworms by walking around in a kind of like an open, like where the dug latrines were. And when he got the hookworms, his asthma actually went away. And he was this guy was in a terrible position. He couldn't work. It was really hard for him to go outside. He had to wear respirators all the time. Any kind of exposure to sort of outdoor air made him extremely ill. He was on high doses of steroids, had gained hundreds of pounds, and he still kind of wasn't functional. So you can see that kind of desperation would drive you to infect yourself with hookworms.
Walk around barefoot in latrines in Africa to treat my asthma.
Yeah.
I mean,
so let me make this clear. I do not recommend this. Yeah.
The idea there, though, is that there's tank brigades of the IgE activated immune part that the worms will activate. That's what happened. That part of the immune system wasn't helping him fight off the asthma?
No, that part of the immune system was causing the asthma. And so if you give it the worms, you give it something to do. Instead of fighting your cells and causing asthma and other kind of allergic and autoimmune reactions, it starts fighting the worms instead, which is what it's meant to do.
I want to get to all like the tasty foods and like the Paleolithic stuff, but I like where this is going in a certain way, which is thinking about the various aspects of your immune system and how so many patients are struggling with autoimmune disorders. There's very high what we call comorbidity. So people who are struggling with depression and anxiety, much more likely to also have autoimmune disorders, things like lupus or ankylosing spondylitis.
Yeah.
Or
Celiac.
Rheumatoid arthritis. Celiac is very common. Pernicious anemia, where you attack vitamin B12, reasonably common. Dr. Deans, do people utilize this, what is it called, hemolyth therapy? I mean, is there a more medicalized version?
Helminth therapy, it has been used in things like Crohn's disease experimentally. And then the other lighter version of this is like a fecal transplant. And Helminth therapy hasn't necessarily played out. It's in larger studies. There are certainly case studies, as are everyone. People have had amazing recovery. And there was a couple of OCD, very, very bad OCD, that got 100% better with like Helminth therapy. Again, I don't recommend it because it can have some certain types of helminths can cause certain types of pneumonitis, pneumonia kind of symptoms. You can have other bad reactions to it. You can get anemia and stuff. But it was just the idea of it.
This is going on all over the world and on the internet. And you and I are both board certified psychiatrists with the ethical obligation not to give treatment recommendations. I hope everybody listening hears this in the context which it is, which is thinking about our mental health, thinking about our minds in the context of evolutionary changes to things like our diet and also things like our worm exposure. And there's a really extreme cool example because Dr. Deans knows about all these interesting evolutionary things. And I bet it's something a lot of us have just never really thought of before. So it doesn't obviously mean run out and get hookworm, but it means that if you have a really overactive immune system in a certain way, you're struggling with autoimmune disease, think in some ways about some of these evolutionary principles, and you know, it's an interesting idea sometimes to explore. But certainly, I hope what people hear is this way that, you know, things have really changed, and it does have a significant effect on our mind. Can we talk a little bit about your clinical work and kind of some of the foundational principles of evolutionary psychiatry? you begin to research and look into this, and I got us a little derailed on this tangent of worms. And I wonder if you can take us back and share again some of the early ideas that you're seeing as you're getting interested and a little disappointed that conventional psychiatry, while great, wasn't asking people about things like food and movement. What do you start to see and what do you start to do?
So what you find, and it was very serendipitous too, because Felice Jacka, obviously, she's one of the biggest writers and studiers of food and mood. And really her first papers, which were her PhD project, actually came out in 2008, 2009. And that was about when I started getting interested in this. And so really the only really all the other studies were mostly in other populations. So they had done studies of depression levels, for example, in people with heart disease while they were trying to do whole diet changes. We'll put this group on a Mediterranean diet for 5 years, and we'll put this group, they just can eat as normal for 5 years. We're tracking their heart health. And along the way, we're also tracking, and it's not like clinical interviews, it's your symptoms of depression and some little checklist that you're filling out, right? And so that's the kind of data that we had prior to Felice Jacka, and then other modern, a few other, not that many, not as many as I would like, other people doing whole diet interventions for things like depression. And what you really find out from observational studies is that all over the world, people who eat more of their kind of traditional diets, which tends to, again, have more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, more variety of food, for example, that those, and less processed food, less Western food. The closer you are to a Western diet, the more likely you are to be sort of obese and depressed and anxious and, high blood pressure, metabolic, all of that comes together. IBS, all sorts of things. And so all over the world, so if you're a Japanese eating more traditional Japanese diet, if you're in Australia eating more of a traditional sort of rancher rural diet, if you're in Sardinia eating more of a kind of a Mediterranean diet, that those people all over the world had much lower rates of depression compared to people who didn't eat that way. You can only extrapolate from observational studies so far, but then we did some of these interventional studies and they found that they use a Mediterranean diet because that's kind of the heart healthy diet du jour that there's the most data for. And they find that it has the effect size similar actually to an SSRI in helping depression. So, that kind of data and learning around that kind of stuff, that's why I don't necessarily prescribe a very specific kind of diet to anybody because, I find in working with people in psychiatry, your interventions are very, very personalized. So if they're having a trouble with their sister, you ask about their relationship with their sister, you ask about the relationship with your sister and the parents, the sister's kids, and you learn all these specifics before you can kind of tease out, what do you think that your mom preferred your sister over you, and how is that affecting your relationship with your daughter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? You use very specifics from their story to help them out. And so I put this into food as well. So if somebody's a vegan, I'm not going to be like, well, being vegan's stupid. That doesn't help anybody. You say, okay, you're vegan. What might we be missing in our nutrients from a vegan diet, and how can we add it in? B12, can we do like nutritional yeast? Sprinkle that on your stuff. Maybe you want to take a supplement of some kind, like an algal DHA supplement, even though, all the data for psych is for EPA. But anyway, you can kind of adjust a diet, meet somebody where they are, and get them to eating more kind of traditional foods and less processed food.
That's a great overview. And I really appreciate your personalized approach. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I always love talking to you is you're a clinician. And so when you're clinicians, one of the just wonderful challenges of that is really having to serve your patients. And patients have strong preferences about their lifestyle. And it's the more we know those and tailor our interventions to those, the more effective we can be. So,
and food's a big part of our lives, and doctors don't always ask people about what they eat. And talking, food is what you cook, or maybe you have a terrible relationship with food because, there's an eating disorder or things like that. And so talking about that is a really rich way to look into somebody's life and to learn more about them. And also, people usually now they're sitting with a psychiatrist voluntarily, in my case, because I'm an outpatient psychiatrist. And people are generally, they light up, and they really, part of the healing process is just being interested in them and listening to them and remembering the next time what they told you, right? There's not a lot of people who are necessarily very good at that.
Yeah, and there's a continuity in a really good psychiatric care of remembering things and knowing people. It's just really unique in the medical field, and a special thing about how you and I get to have gotten to travel this path so far. I'm just getting to know a number of people incredibly well, and then to learn from that, to see what works. As you notice that, and it's very exciting now to have data that food has an equal effect size to SSRIs. And I suspect, like me, a lot of patients do really great on both of those, and those combined have an even better effect. And you throw in a little therapy and some movement and focus in on, as you noted, what can be some very personal and specific issues for people. And it's a wonderful path forward. I wanted to stick on food for a second. Are there foods that you find yourself over and over kind of recommending as go-to easy brain foods, especially for busy people? And, for example, I talk a lot. I talk a big lentil game these days. I talk a lot about pesto. Do you have a few that really you find very handy for your patients?
So we'll talk about, a lot of times people find themselves eating on the go. And so what can I carry around with me? For example, unsalted mixed nuts, lots of vitamins, minerals, a little protein, a little bit of fat. You don't want to eat tons of them, right? But unsalted means that you don't, or light salt means you tend to eat less of them, right? And then I like to talk up proteins that you can find easily and kind of maybe even carry around. And how do you enrich your breakfast, for example, with protein? That's usually a pretty easy one, because often people eat a really high carby processed food breakfast.
What are a couple of your favorite protein ads?
So egg whites, adding egg whites, you could stir it into, this sounds terrible. It sounds gross, but it's actually really good. You could stir egg whites into oatmeal, for example, and cook it up. It doesn't come out, if you stir it up, it doesn't come out as this weird gloppy egg white / oatmeal mess. It's actually really nice. Protein powder, that's a processed food, but it's a perfectly fine addition to your morning smoothie or your morning oatmeal, or even if you're making up some pancakes, you add a little protein powder.
Are you like camp whey, camp pea protein? Do you have desiccated grass-fed bison liver? Like what protein do you?
So I don't think a ton of that really matters all that much when you're talking about your protein powder. You worry, I don't want the protein powder from, not to denigrate, I guess they're out of business now, but like Christmas Tree Shop, that God knows where it came from, is probably adulterated with cadmium or something.
The Christmas tree protein now?
But no, like Christmas Tree Shops, you can buy spices and stuff there. Okay. Anyway, so I do, I'll go to the regular grocery store and get whey protein is a nice cheap one, so I just like it. But I'll also try to push more sort of foods. Actually, low-fat string cheese is a great source of protein that you can just carry around and have for a snack along with an apple or something like that. Seafood, where can you get it? How can you cook it? Maybe you don't like salmon or something, that you might think that has a really good shot of omega-3s. Do you like tuna fish salad? Doesn't have a ton of omega-3s, but then you can use a high oleic, mayonnaise with some omega-3s in it, in order to, make the salad. You can also mash up sardines, which are actually pretty high in omega-3s, into a tuna fish salad. You won't even taste it. I know you don't believe me, but it's actually true. I did this for my kids all the time, and they never once noticed that I added sardines in there.
Sneak anchovies into your tuna salad. But not some, sneak them if you have to, but also I like your notion of, because it's not a way that we often think about cooking, right? But combining seafoods or combining something like a lower omega-3 fish that might be a little more familiar to your palate and upping the omega-3s, or even in little places where, again, it's not a big add of omega-3 fats, but if you can get some in your mayonnaise or get a better quality mayonnaise in that, it does improve the nutrient density or the nutrient profile of something like a tuna salad.
And people usually take to those substitutions a little easier than changing their entire diet.
I think it's a great point where something like a tuna fish salad with mayonnaise and some egg in there, and that might raise some eyebrows here or there, but kind of helping people explore and have diverse set of foods within the seafood food category, I think is a really much nicer way to approach it. I didn't eat any seafood, as I mentioned earlier, when I was younger, and so for me, for a little while, I was like fried shrimp.
Right.
It's kind
Yeah.
of and then that expanded, and then oddly went and added sushi, which wouldn't really think is the next step, but it's really where a lot of people get introduced to some very mild and delicious seafoods.
Yeah. And things like, my family actually really, none of them like seafood except for me. I'm not a huge fan, but I like to eat it for my health. And so what I buy is the individually frozen, salmon breasts or, halibut breast, whatever. I guess they're not really breast I guess that's not a
Fillet,
mammal,
something.
a fillet.
Fillets
Yeah.
okay. I mean, if you want to make it
So
the breast of the fish, I mean, it's like
yeah.
kind of.
But, and so I have the individual ones, and you can just defrost those in 30 minutes in, water on your counter, set a timer, and then you can cook that right away. It takes, 10 to 20 minutes to cook, depending on what kind of fish it is in your oven. So it's a super easy way where you can get home from work, defrost something. You don't have to think ahead and, I have that marinated chicken that I thought ahead and I defrosted it the day before. I never think that far ahead, right? So I like things that you can have in your fridge or in your pantry and you can cook right away.
I really agree with that. I think there's full support. Some people are meal planners, they meal, the batch prep, all that stuff. I kind of like some of the creative process. I don't know exactly what we're having for dinner tonight. I know what we had last night. It was great. But yeah, I'm thinking, we haven't had seafood. Maybe this meal will inspire me. So again, if you've got the frozen, maybe shrimp, maybe wild salmon, some tins of anchovy or some cans of wild salmon, a lot of ways that I can move without having to put in a lot of effort. I'm allowed to, kind of be creative, get a lot of nutrient density. For me, that I find that time kind of soothing, and I always think it's kind of fun what you come up with. So I really love that tip of kind of having the freezer stocked.
And
Uh,
canned beans, canned
Canned beans,
canned
amen to
black
canned beans.
beans.
Canned white beans with pesto. Ooh,
Yeah,
I mean that's
pesto's
probably
really
one.
good. Yeah.
That's one of the easy. That's a really fancy side. I think that's so easy. Just rinse a can of white beans. I like the small. I think the cannelli beans, or cannellini.
Cannellini is what they're called, I believe.
Cannellini beans, and a little tablespoon of pesto. I'm really big on the Gotham greens pesto recently, which is they've got a spicy one. Oh boy! Again, so easy. Open a can, open a package, but lots of nutrient density. Beans, top source of fiber, top source of magnesium. Great slow burning carb.
I like chickpeas. There's a great recipe where you drain a can of chickpeas, you add a little bit cut up feta cheese, and just a package of those small cherry tomatoes. You throw it on a sheet pan, maybe a little parsley, salt, pepper, olive oil, paprika if you're being fancy. Shove that in the oven at 400 for 35 minutes. It's gorgeous. It's just really easy. It tastes super good, and you get that protein from the chickpeas. It's a very nice side, kind of vegetable side thing to other things that you eat too. And the kids love that actually.
I feel like I'm in a nutritional psychiatry rap battle right now, and I'm just gonna be
Right.
like taco night. That would be probably my next bean meal if we were in a nutritional psychiatry bean-based rap battle, I'd break out taco night right now. Cause I mean, that's an incredible way to do beans. And what I love about taco night is that creativity I was suggesting, you just kind of, make something kind of the your way. Everybody gets to do that at taco night in a family a little differently. And I find for when you're cooking for four and everybody has a little different taste preference, taco night goes a long way.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I think about when I'm talking to people is that people will often be low in some of their minerals and iron. And, how can we encourage that in kind of a healthy way? And some people, it does mean adding a tiny bit of red meat if they totally don't eat any kind of thing, that they don't like the texture of red meat.
Lots of people like. What's your practical take on red meat? I mean, it's such a controversial topic, but as a clinician and a parent, like, how do you approach red meat?
I'm from Texas. I love steak. It tastes really good. It's kind of expensive, which is why I don't eat it all the time, but I love it. And I don't think there's really any convincing evidence, especially something like steak or, whole meat, like that kind of thing is necessarily bad for you. There is some evidence for example, highly processed meats. So if you're eating tons of bologna and, pepperoni and things like that, there's lots of sodium in there. There's lots of things in there. So I tell people if they're eating tons of, because that's an easy way to eat too, is you just have tons of processed meat in your fridge and you add, a lot of people do that really quick. It's a nice, easy thing. So I say, you know what, switch over to your turkey breast, over to your roast beef slices. That's really good. Things that are a little less sodium and a little less processing for the majority.
I got a plug in here for my good friend Chris, who has the Jackson Hole buffalo company. And it's called Tonga, I think, is the name for it. And it's just the air dried buffalo meat, sort of very traditional American food. And to me, just has a really a nicer. I just like, if you're a jerky fan, it's a really healthy way to do a jerky.
And even here in Massachusetts, you can buy frozen bison burger. There's a Montana, what is that restaurant? Montana Joe's or something. There's one around here. You can go get it.
We're in Wyoming right now, Dr. Deans. And so, I can tolerate a little Texas, but you want to throw down Montana. I don't know how I'm going to feel. I'm going to get territorial. I'm just new to Wyoming territorialness. But now I want to talk about mental fitness, Dr. Deans. We're talking about food, everybody. We've been talking about an evolutionary perspective, and there's kind of a new perspective, I think, sometimes called mental fitness, is what we've been talking about, really, of, how can we create a framework around these evolutionary psychiatry principles and nutritional psychiatry principles and operationalize a bit for everyone ways to take care of our mental health that are, as like we're in this 1 to 2 year generation experiment with digital life. A lot of data is not going so well for a lot of people. And so I wonder if you can, when you think about like mental fitness heroes, like people who are doing it right, I'm wondering if there's some folks that inspire you that you could share with us to help inspire us.
People with lots of resilience. That's an interesting question. And a lot of the people that I know, I can't talk about because they're my patients. So
you can't tell us their name, but could you share a little bit, maybe in an honest way, like about what you're seeing in them and maybe how they got it?
So I guess what I love about my work is seeing how different people endure all sorts of things and really kind of bounce through it. And people will tend to have really amazing coping skills and resilience in certain areas and then kind of fail miserably in other areas. And so that's a very interesting thing about most human beings, is that we all have kind of weaknesses. And so, I'm trying to think. It's not that I don't admire people. It's just sometimes I don't know. I feel like I don't really know a lot of people. All you know is your impression. Like Nikola Tesla was an amazing genius and a really, really interesting person. And I've read a bunch of stuff about him and I admire him a great deal. He did struggle some with some mental health problems, and he had this whole tiff with Edison, who was apparently a horrible, narcissistic, dreadful genius of his own. But it's hard when you don't know somebody. It's hard to know what to admire about them. How much of it is, Simone Biles. My God, she's someone who really overcame. They call it the twisties, right, in gymnastics, not the yips. And came back and to win all these gold medals. That kind of resilience, and also just 27 years old and go. My roommate in medical school was a gymnast, and she had so many broken bones, and it was unbelievable, like how tough you must be mentally to do that, and how amazing, to have that physicality, which I'm not a very physical person or good at physical stuff at all. So that kind of thing.
Are there ways that you have seen your patients or see people kind of build more resiliency?
Yeah, so wisdom, just life wisdom. So getting older has kind of twofold thing, is that you realize what's important and what's not, and what you can pay attention to, stuff that probably would have really offended me or really bothered me, when I was a teen. I don't even care about anymore now, right? And ways that I would have acted as a teen, I would never act that way now. And I feel kind of bad looking back on how I might have treated somebody, for example, as a teenager. And so age brings with you wisdom and that additional I think it's sort of anti-anxiety kind of resiliency and knowledge and experience. The problem with age is that it brings on increasing losses, right? So, but you and I'm sure, have lost friends, family changes, things like that. Are parents getting older? Somebody in your life has died in a car accident. Somebody's died of cancer. Those kinds of losses, and you just get more and more and more as you get older, and then you have your own medical problems. And so I think what I like to see in a human being is, and this is something that one of our residency advisors told us a long time ago, that part of the job of being a psychiatrist is trying to learn to be as wise as your grandparents pretty fast so that you can kind of help people sort through things. That was George Valiant actually said that. And
oh boy, if everybody, George Valiant is one of the real legends in psychiatry. George Valiant, I'm going to forget this, not the Whitehall, that's in the UK, but he
did, it was the Harvard studies of like when people aged, he studied men.
Studies. And then his book, I think, is The Triumphs of Experience, which is really one of the first portraits. The study that I was thinking of is, I think it's 100 men. And they followed 100 Harvard, classic Harvard guys, interviewing them every year. And George Valiant was a psychiatrist and I think psychoanalyst, and wrote about character and about kind of what made these men successful. And in some ways, a very selected population. But it's great to hear his advice and your way it's influenced you, and a way that everyone can perhaps think a bit about some of where we can all tap into a little bit of wisdom that we have, of leaning into that kind of grandparent within us. I think one of the wonderful things about your work, Emily, is you said it earlier. I'm not sure what other people felt, but I got this real sense of my lineage, not going back just one generation or two generations, but going all the way back. And somehow, some way, I'm connected one by one, generation after generation, of people surviving and being resilient. And I think it's just such a wonderful way for us to think about some of our responsibility, to be kind, to create community, to create health for ourselves and for others, but also as a way to take care of our mental health and to improve our mental fitness, really. That how we build our resiliency and how we think about, I like that idea of kind of punching above our weight when it comes to maturity. And
Try.
and trying. I mean, I think as I hope everybody listening hears from both of us, we're quite experienced psychiatrists at this point, with between the two of us, probably 50, almost 60 years of clinical experience, and it's and we're still working on getting it right, getting it better, learning more, helping people more effectively. So that's some of how it goes in mental health, and that's some of what makes it wonderful.
Yeah, and if I were to wrap up with what some more resilience and things that are helpful for people, which I think we know from Piaget and these other people who studied, coping mechanisms through the life, is that generativity is really important. Whether that's having your own family and having your own kids, or working with kids, after your own kids have gone to college, or if you don't have any kids, maybe in your church or in your community, coaching basketball, whatever it is that you can do to kind of be around a younger generation. Or there are other elements of generativity, for example, being creative in a hobby, making things, being really excited about antique cars and taking pictures of them and sharing them on the internet, or, whatever it is. So generativity is super important to staying resilient as we get older.
Oh, such a great word, such this classic stage of development, generativity versus stagnation. And so when we're feeling stuck, as Dr. Jim Gordon calls it sometimes, a lot of people call it, right? But as you're feeling, down, or you're struggling, thinking about, kind of stirring things up, getting generative, creating something, connecting, contributing, are really, ways that things, sometimes we're in a state we don't feel like doing them, but once we do them, we feel great. Dr. Deans, it is such a treat to get to speak with you. We're going to have you back on soon. We're going to link to your blog, but also your new book. And I really look forward to getting deep into the science of nutritional psychiatry, what's emerging when it comes to the immune system and the microbiome, and talking more with you as our field really continues to evolve from the very beginning when we started presenting at the American Psychiatric Association
Long time ago. Yeah.
annual meeting a long time ago. It's really just been a treat to be your colleague and be your friend, and feel your support as this field has really just exploded. And I really look forward to seeing you down the road. Thanks so much for joining us. Everybody, as usual, please take some of this, whatever resonated with you. Hopefully, maybe you got a little chills or goosebumps, maybe something that Dr. Dean said really hit home. Please make use of it in your mental health and mental fitness journey. I can't wait to see you all in the next episode. Please subscribe and share this, and I'll talk to you all soon. Thanks so much.